would go to districts that didn't need the aid in construction. The districts that did need the aid in construction, or that help and benefit, didn't get anything. And that system, unfortunately, was replicated in other states, where districts that did not need extra federal help in school construction would indeed have gotten extra federal help. It simply means that we don't necessarily know all of the variances that a state and local government does, and therefore we make different decisions. When I was Speaker of the House in Utah, I was obviously always upset with the federal government for putting more restrictions on me as a state legislator. There was one year in which the federal government, in all their wisdom, insisted that we buy a new computer system. This was back in the era when computers were big and bulky and they took up most of a room. We didn't want it, but we did not have any option. If we wanted to have Carl Perkins funds, which go to technical education, we had to buy a new system, a new computer system out of state funds. We couldn't transfer money. It had to come out of state funds. The bottom line is, we did not spend as much on kids for technical education that year, because instead we had to take our funds and spend it on a computer system that we didn't want, that we didn't need, and we also never used, simply because it was a federal mandate. That's what you lose in this process. Utah had some great registration rolls until the federal government insisted that motor voter had to be a mandate that every state did. So instead of being able to go through our election rolls, our voter rolls, every 4 years as we were doing to make sure they were current, we now cannot do it until 10 years have passed. Consequently, if you look at the number of people who are now registered in the state of Utah and the number of kids we have, the numbers, quite frankly, don't add up. Our voter rolls are in worse shape because the federal government insisted the state had to do it a particular way in every state, whether it made sense or not, and the state had to actually pay for that opportunity at the same time. We had a bill before us a few weeks ago in which we tried to mandate physical education. There is nothing wrong with physical education in our public schools. There's nothing wrong with emphasizing it. There is nothing wrong with kids needing it. What is wrong is that Congress is not a school board, and school boards should be making those kinds of decisions. And one of the things that we have to realize is that words in the course of history change their meaning. If you went back to the time of the Constitution and you used the word awful, awful back then did not mean something that was bad. Awful meant something that was good and inspired awe. If you talked about a natural man was somebody back then who was a reasonable individual. If you also talked about the verb to discover, discover back then did not mean to find something you don't know about. It meant to reveal something about which you do know to someone else. Words have different meanings. One of the phrases that's in the Constitution, both in the first article as well as in the preamble, is the phrase general welfare. That's one of the phrases that means different things. Today, we have the tendency of reading that word and emphasizing the last word of welfare. Founding fathers, when they wrote that phrase, emphasized the first word of general, which simply meant that the federal government was only supposed to do things that impacted the general welfare. With emphasis on the word general, it meant only doing those things that impacted everybody in this country, not a particular person. That's why Presidents Madison and Monroe vetoed road projects. Jackson vetoed a road project because the road project only helped and benefited people in the area of that road and therefore was not general welfare. Well, we have changed that concept as time simply has gone on, not necessarily for the better. I was giving a speech once on this very floor, in which I talked about how they meant general welfare to be and how it was a restricting concept, not an expansive concept. And I got a call from one of the C-SPAN viewers the next day saying, I appreciated the speech, it was very nice. However, she took umbrage at what I said because she said there were certain programs the government did that she liked. I said, ma'am, you have missed the very point I and the Founding Fathers were taking. Founding Fathers said you don't have to have all these programs. What they said is not every program has to be designed and administered and funded through Washington. That those programs are opportunities and can be done as long as equally as well being done by a state and local government as they are here. Look, through all my life, My party has talked about trying to reduce the size and scope of government. And I think, as Mr. Neugebauer pointed out, that the deficit we had in 1962 was $100 million. Our deficit today should be somewhere around $3.5 trillion. Obviously, we have failed somewhere. In the history of this country over the last half century, both Republicans and Democrats, the growth of government in Washington has continued. Not necessarily, I mean, the best thing I can say is one party has had a slower growth pattern than the other party, but that's about the best you can say, because growth has happened. It is almost as if leaders in Washington, regardless of party, are unable to stop the size and the expansion and the growth of the federal government. The reality is that our current system is basically rigged in favor of government growth. The incentives, the bureaucracy, power structure, institutions of Washington have all evolved to help the federal government to acquire more power and influence, not less. What we need to do is look at a change in approach, and that's what the Founding Fathers were talking about. Not our goal, but our approach. What the Founding Fathers were talking about is not simply cutting government, it was dispersing government. So different levels of government could do different kinds of programs, and not everything has to come through Washington. That's one of the things that we're talking about with the 10th Amendment Caucus, is how can we find ways to disperse government programs back to local governments where they can be done more creatively, more efficiently, and understanding local circumstances, whether it be PE programs or school constructions or technical education or voting roads or voting registration rolls or roads or anything else. Now that's what the Founding Fathers intended, that the programs be implemented at state level and the tax money for those programs remain at those local levels, state and local levels instead, which is why, as Mr. Conway said, this is not a program about liberals and conservatives. If a liberal wants to expand government, fine, it can be done under federalism. But what you do is make sure that the government that is closest to the people runs it, so it is a much more effective and efficient government program. And if you're a conservative who wants limited government in some way, then fine, you can do that as well. You both get what you want if federalism and the 10th Amendment are respected here in Washington as true principles of the way we govern ourselves and how we conduct ourselves in the future. That is indeed the goal of what should be here, the goal of the importance. That's the importance of the 10th Amendment. It should allow people to get what they want, which is better government, more efficient government, better and more efficient programs. I recognize that we have a couple of others who have joined us here. I am appreciative that the gentlelady from North Carolina, Representative Fox, is here. I'd like to yield her as much time as she may wish to consume on this topic as well.
Well, I thank Mr. Bishop, the gentleman from Utah, for being in charge of this special order tonight and bringing to the American people what I think is one of the most critical issues facing us in this country, and that is the issue of federalism and the need for us to adhere to the 10th Amendment of the Constitution of the United States. Too few people really understand the role of the federal government in our country. We've gotten away from the teaching of the Constitution. We've gotten away from the teaching of the role of government in our country. People have this notion that they have this right and that right, and if you press them to tell you whether they've read the Constitution or not, most of them will tell you they have not, and they really do not understand, again, what the roles of our respective governments are. In the last week, while we had a little bit of time away from Washington and I managed to squeeze out some quiet time, I had the chance to read a Joseph Ellis book called American Creation, which talks about the triumphs and the tragedies of the beginning of our country. And it's really important that we understand that there were a lot of conflicts that came about in the founding of the United States. It wasn't as smooth a thing as many of us think that it was. But one thing that was very clear to all of the founders was the issue of federalism. They were, the idea of the United States of America was a radical idea to begin with. Never before had people believed that they had freedoms and that they had inalienable rights given to them by God. So it was a totally radical idea. But add to that the idea that you shouldn't have a federal government that would control everything from Washington, and it was absolutely radical. And we owe a great deal to George Washington, our first president, for not trying to be a king and understanding that we needed to send power, delegate power, let power be held at the state and local levels. We can see the unhealthiness of the growing role of the federal government fairly easy in numbers, and I'm going to quote a couple of numbers for you. Since 1995 alone, the federal government has issued nearly 60,000 new rules governing everything from the size of the holes in Swiss cheese to what colors are allowed for surgical stitches. Federal spending surpassed $100 billion only in 1962 for the first time. That was a huge amount of money in 1962. And back then people were saying $1 million here, $1 million there, and pretty soon you're talking about real money. In 2010, the federal spending will surpass $3.5 trillion. I think there are very few people in the country who really believe that the best way to do things is to have them done by the federal government. I'm a very, very strong 10th Amendment person, as are my colleagues here, and I'm really pleased to be a part of the 10th Amendment task force. And perhaps my colleagues went over these earlier, but I'm going to mention them very quickly, what our mission is and what our goals are. Our mission is to disperse power from Washington and restore the constitutional balance of power through liberty-enhancing federalism. And we have 5 goals. Educate Congress and the public about federalism. You might wonder why Congress needs to be educated, but many members of Congress really don't understand the concept of federalism. Number 2, develop proposals to disperse power to regional entities, states, local governments, private institutions, community groups, families, and individuals. 3, elevate federalism as a core Republican focus. 4, monitor threats to 10th Amendment principles. And 5, help build and foster a Federalist constituency. So we know what it is we need to be doing. We have worked as a constitutional caucus in the past to do our best to educate people. But focusing, I think, on the 10th Amendment is very, very important. And again, I'm very pleased to be a part of this. Let me say some more about federalism. The term is foreign to many people, but most Americans care about the things that federalism brings without even knowing it. Federalism brings choice, options, flexibility, and freedom. Federalism is not a concept of either the right or the left. It is neither a Republican nor a Democrat idea. Decentralization and community empowerment can be a worthy goal of both the left and the right. Both sides have something to gain under a Federalist revival. And this is not yesterday's states' rights arguments. It's much bigger than that. This is about better governance. This is about adjusting modern politics to modern life. This is about breaking up big, inefficient, unresponsive government and returning power to the people. As my colleague was using some illustrations a little bit ago about education, as one who was involved with education a great deal before coming to Congress, I wholly subscribe to the concepts which he presented. Let me give a couple of other things about federalism, and then I'm going to turn it back to my colleague from Utah or to my colleague from Texas, both of whom are extremely eloquent on this issue. In a nutshell, federalism is the best system because it brings government closer to the people, it nurtures civic virtue, it protects liberty, it takes advantage of local information, it stimulates policy innovation, and it alleviates political tensions. In other words, federalism was the founders' original formula for freedom and good government. It's time to reinvigorate this freedom-enhancing principle of government. Again, I know very few people who believe that we should go to the federal government to solve all of our problems. We should first solve the problems that government needs to solve at the local level, then at the state level, and as a last resort, go to the federal government. Unfortunately, too many people think of the federal government first, and that complicates our lives. We have a huge deficit and a huge debt right now because too many people have looked to the federal government to solve problems that could have been solved at the local and state levels for much less money and in a much more efficient way. I just give one example, the problem that we're having in the Gulf right now. That is a problem that does need to be solved by the federal government. But is the federal government prepared to do that? No. Why? Because the federal government's involved with way too many other things. The federal government should be looking after national security. I think national parks, our interstate highways, maybe the Federal Aviation Administration, but we're doing too much or attempting to do too much at the federal level and not doing those things that we should be doing as well as we should be doing. So again, I want to thank my